From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel, a Wall Street Journal opinion podcast. This week, my guest is Scott Rasmussen, president of RMG Research, pollster, analyst, and host of the Scott Rasmussen Show. Scott, thank you so much for being here. First of all, let's just clarify one thing, because I know there's a lot of confusion out there. Rasmussen Reports, which is your old firm, you left it a decade ago. You have a different firm now, RMG Research. I guess it's the perils of having a famous name, huh?
I guess so. It leads to a lot of confusion. But all my work these days is done through RMG Research, and just happy to make clarification whenever I can.
Well, I do want to talk about some amazing research that you've done, which I think presents us with a whole new way to look at our state of politics in the country at the moment. We've talked about this, the us versus them election. But before that, let's just talk about what's going on at the moment. We've had a pretty momentous month, an assassination attempt against Donald Trump. The Republicans formalized his nomination. He chose a vice president. Democrats pushed Joe Biden off the ballot. They've now united around Kamala Harris. She's chosen her VP. I know I saw you say a couple of weeks ago when she first looked to be the presumptive nominee that it was going to take a couple weeks for the polls to start giving us some indications of what's going on. We're now at that 3-week mark. What are you seeing in your research and other polls? Where do you think the state of this race is?
The race is very close. In our latest polling, we show Harris nationwide up by a single point. In a lot of ways, the polls with Harris and Trump are almost the same as they were with Trump and Biden on June 26th, the day before that infamous debate. But there are some differences. First off, Harris can actually run a campaign and go out and give speeches. So there's some enthusiasm. I think there was a great sigh of relief from many people in the nation that the choice wasn't going to be just Trump versus Biden. A lot of people weren't looking forward to that. So Vice President Harris got a nice bounce. In our polling, she went up 5 points. And, it was bringing all the traditional Democratic groups back home. She did better among black voters, among young voters. Now that seems to have faded. And I think if the election were held today, we would all be looking at about 6 key swing states, the same as we were way back when. But still, voters don't know much about Harris. She hasn't done interviews. She hasn't done press conferences. The only issue that most voters recognize that she holds relates to her strong position on abortion, the strong pro-choice position.
So are you saying that this was a honeymoon and that maybe the honeymoon is already over? Or by the way, I keep wondering, could she just have a honeymoon all the way until the election, given that the press isn't pressing her to do any of those questions or interviews?
Really, that's the key question. If she was a traditional candidate running through the primaries, running through a full year-long campaign, the views that she holds, the policy positions that she's taken would make her a very difficult candidate. It's hard to imagine her ever winning a nomination or winning an election. But we are close. So if President Trump is unable to connect her with the policies of the Biden administration and her own policy past, maybe she can get through until Election Day on this little bit of a honeymoon. But let's be clear, even right now when you're talking like this, the race is a toss-up. It's not like she's up 10 points in this honeymoon phase. We have one candidate who is very well. Whether you love him or hate him, people know what they think about Donald Trump. And so the variable is going to be on the margins with what people learn about Vice President Harris. And the other thing, and this is something political people hate to talk about, they analyze endlessly the choice of the vice presidential nominees. They talk about political speeches and was this the right line? But they don't talk about the real world very much. The economy is still the driving force in the election. In political terms, the most important indicator we have is we track whether people think their own personal finances are getting better or worse. If people perceive their finances are getting worse between now and November, worse than they are today, that's really good news for Donald Trump. If people perceive their own personal finances are getting better, that's really good for Vice President Harris. And that's something that neither candidate can control.
Well, at the risk of drilling in on something that you just said doesn't matter so much, just curious, have you done polling since she chose Tim Walz? And does it say anything? Was it a good pick, not a great pick? Does it matter? Does anyone even know who he is?
We actually polled on the day she made the announcement. And as you recall, there was incredible wall-to-wall coverage of this event and analysis. And on that day, 45% of voters said, who? They didn't know who he was. And the rest were split along partisan lines. So if you were a Democrat, you said it was a good thing. You liked him. If you were a Republican, you said the opposite. And very few had strong opinions. I think the reality is both presidential candidates basically doubled down on their base. And I don't think it's going to make a whole lot of difference. It's always possible. I said on June 26th before the debate that the Trump-Biden debate probably wouldn't matter either because most debates don't. Obviously, I didn't expect the performance from the president that we got. So could Vance or Walz do something? Yeah, but not likely.
I want to talk about that a little bit more and the issues a little bit more. But just one thing that you said, let me ask to clarify. To the extent that she has improved herself in the polls, is it mostly an enthusiasm question? Is it mostly, like you said, getting those voters back on board? Or is she actually changing hearts and minds, pulling people over to her side?
It's mostly enthusiasm and reclaiming that Democratic base. You know, there were a lot of people who could never vote for Donald Trump and then who saw Joe Biden in that debate and thought, I can't imagine this for 4 more years. So some of those people came back. One way I described it is with Biden in the race, it was like the Democrats were coming to bat in the bottom of the 9th down by about 7 runs. You know, there's virtually no chance of winning. When Harris jumped in, it was like they were down by a run going into the bottom of the 9th. Still a little bit of an uphill fight, but very plausible to see a path to victory. And right now, you know, we're pretty much back in that toss-up state. I would say, Kim, that if somebody tells you with great confidence that they know how this election is going to turn out today, they're either lying to themselves or to you.
Okay, I'm going to bear that in mind and make sure you don't tell me where things are going. So on the issues question, obviously inflation, interest rates, the economy, immigration, crime, are those the things you are seeing that's still where people are most focused on? Are there any sleeper issues out there that you've noticed, cultural questions that you think can really resonate? Just are the campaigns hitting on the right themes?
Well, every week we ask an open-ended question about what's the most important issue. And every week of this year, the top issues have either been inflation or other economic concerns. The other option is immigration is always there in the top 3. Now, among Democrats, abortion is a very important issue. It's not among the rest of the electorate. And on that issue, that's something that can help with turnout for the Democrats. I think the sleeper issues, you can never tell what's going to pop, but there are a number of cultural issues out there that could cause trouble for the progressive Democrats. One that comes to mind because of some recent events is the question of biological males competing in women's sports. Only about 14% of voters think that should be allowed. Only 21% of Harris voters think biological males should be allowed to compete in women's sports. But very few people know that Kamala Harris is supportive of that policy. So perhaps things like that could emerge that would give the sense that she's a somewhat radical progressive Democrat, but it wouldn't be the issue per se as the impression it gave of Vice President Harris.
Those are some extraordinary numbers. Talk about an issue that has cross-party appeal. Wow. We're going to take a break now. I'll be back soon with more from Scott Rasmussen. Welcome back. Kim Strassel here with Scott Rasmussen, president of RMG Research and host of the Scott Rasmussen Show. So you talked about the national election, your national poll, and then these battleground states. We tend to sometimes lump them all together. How is everyone doing in the battleground states? But obviously these states are very different. I guess 2 questions. One, Are you among those that are of the belief that this could all come down to Pennsylvania? And then also, how do you look at Trump and Harris's relative strength in some of those different battleground states?
Pennsylvania is the most important state. I don't think it's the only state. There's two clusters, basically, of swing states right now. There's a handful of southern states, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. Some would add North Carolina to that. When President Biden was in the race, I would have said that those states are pretty much leaning in the Republican direction. With Harris, it's still a little bit unclear how much of an edge Trump might have or might not have in those states. So there is a larger path to victory for Harris than there was for Biden. When you come to those three blue wall states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, in the case with Biden in the race, he would have had to win all three. Again, it's a little less clear, but that's still where the action is going to be on election night. I think if you're talking about swing states, there's one other state I'd like to throw in the mix, and it's one nobody's talking about because it's not swing for the presidential election. But the most important Senate race in the nation is in Montana. Not a swing state, obviously, at the presidential level. But if Vice President Harris were to win this election, Montana would determine which party controls the U.S. Senate, which would be of enormous importance.
That's incredibly important because that tends to get lost in this debate about presidential politics is not just it matters to whom is actually in the White House. But if you think about the Democratic agenda, too, remember, we've been having this conversation about getting rid of the filibuster, et cetera, Supreme Court reforms. All of that is potentially on the line.
And think about judicial appointments. If Vice President Harris is in office and John Tester hangs on to win in Montana, the judicial appointments for the next 4 years would take the nation in a very different direction.
Absolutely. So let's change focus here just a little bit. You have this very new and I think fascinating way of looking at the electorate. We have long tried to divvy up voters along in different ways when you talk about polling and demographics, the rich and the poor. A lot of times these are related to general measures of wealth. Are you college educated, not college educated, white collar, blue collar? And then obviously we divide people on gender and race and geography. But you became very intrigued over the last year by this consistent outlier data from a subset of Americans. And you have since defined those as voters with a postgraduate degree earning more than $150,000 a year and living in a very high density area. So these are lawyers and doctors. And you have now conducted some surveys of these elites, as you call it, the elite 1%. And fascinating results. What are some of the things that you found in that polling?
Well, the first research that we did on this was commissioned by the Committee to Unleash Prosperity, Steve Moore's group. And we found an enormous gap in terms of trust in government and individual freedom. Most Americans believe that there's too little individual freedom in our nation. But half of this elite 1% said, no, there's too much. And one of the subsets of the elites, the politically active elites, people who talk politics all the time, 69% of them said the rest of us have too much individual freedom. When we talked about trust in government, 70% of these elites say they trust the government to do the right thing most of the time. Guess what? Hardly any voters do. About 22% of voters. It's been 50 years since most voters had that kind of trust. So there's a big gap there. When you begin to look at policy issues and other things, you see enormous differences on topics ranging from education to climate change. And in the latest research we did for the Napolitan Institute, the number that jumps out at me is most of these elites, even though their views on a range of issues are widely out of touch with most Americans, they believe most Americans agree with them on key issues. Among the politically active elites, 82% think most Americans agree with them on things. And that scares me because that lets them rationalize bending the rules a little bit to do what they want.
That's absolutely astonishing. I mean, a couple more things that came out of that first research you did for the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. 74% of the elites say their finances are getting better. That's compared with 20% of the rest of voters. You did this back when President Biden was still in the running, but they gave him an 84% approval rating compared with 40% from the non-elites. Large majorities of them have a favorable view of university professors, journalists, lawyers, and even members of Congress. That's astonishing to me. But here is another one that jumped out. 77% of elites support strict rationing of gas, meat, and electricity to fight climate change versus 28% of everyone else. I mean, the disconnect is mind-boggling. And yet, I think the important thing here in this is these folks, even though there's not very many of them, they hold positions of power. They are in influential positions. So we hear about their views more than everyone else's. Is that not part of the point of this?
That's absolutely the truth. These are people who know that if there's an issue they care about, they can go to the appropriate government official and get an audience, or they can go to their representative in Congress. These are people who are around media types and who are establishing media narratives. They are on corporate boards. These are people with a tremendous level of influence. A large segment of them went to what we might call the Ivy Plus schools. And those schools tend to fill the ranks of corporate boards and others. So yes, tremendous.
Journalists.
Journalists as well. That's right. And, at first when I saw the numbers on trust and all of these other things we're talking about, I was a little puzzled, but then I just began to realize it's because they know them. The more recent research we've done shows that these people overwhelmingly recognize that if they care about an issue, they can get their congressman to listen to them. Among ordinary voters, only 11% have that confidence. It's not really anything more than these people are in a bubble and the government leadership is in it with them, which is what led us to do our recent survey on federal government managers. And what's a little bit chilling about that data is in many ways, their views, the people who are managers in the federal government today, they have views that align more with the elite 1% than they do with the American people. One example, hot topic recently, social media censorship. Very few voters think the federal government should have the right to censor social media posts. A majority, a narrow majority of the elite 1% thinks it should have that. And by the way, 53% of federal government managers think that they should have that right to censor social media posts. Pretty dramatic difference.
And these are the people, just to clarify, these are the people that are making those decisions. I mean, these are the bureaucrats, right? I mean, when we say it loosely, the deep state, correct? And so I think another piece of research you had there that if they think a regulation is needed and know that voters oppose it, most of them, meaning more than 50%, said that they should just ignore voters and implement that regulation anyway.
Exactly right. 54% say, we know the voters disagree with this. They overwhelmingly oppose that. And we made it clear in the question, overwhelmingly oppose it, but that's okay. We think it's the right thing to do. This is a direct rejection of America's founding ideals. I mean, the voters are supposed to be in charge.
Here's what I find so interesting about this research, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is to me, I think it helps explain the mood out there that you see among many voters in the country, which is they feel as though they're not in control, that the government is not working for them, but rather against them, that there are these vast forces arrayed against the little guy. And I wonder if this doesn't help explain and account for some of the embrace of populism you've seen out there among both parties, this attempt to say, I'm for the average Joe, the forgotten man. I wonder if it doesn't explain some of the shifting voting patterns that we are seeing. For instance, more and more college educated voters now voting for Democrats, more and more working class Americans voting for Republicans. Do you think that this helps explain some of those changes out there?
Absolutely. In fact, I believe that this views and approach of the elite 1% are the root cause of the political toxicity we have in America today, the root cause of this dysfunction, because they embrace a view that is pretty disrespectful of voters. They think we should have a government of experts. They think they should be making the decisions. And when other people get in the way, it's sort of annoying to them. So I do think that's a big part of it. Another part of it, and this goes back to what I mentioned a moment ago about they tend to think that most Americans share their views. We asked about specific issues. Regardless of your own opinion, do you think most Americans support X, Y, or Z? And their perspectives were wildly out of touch. So about 3 out of 4 members of both the elite 1% and also among government managers think most Americans want to live in a city where guns are outlawed, in a community where guns are outlawed, and where private ownership of guns is banned. That's not where the public is, not even close. Most people in these elite circles do think most Americans trust the government and have these higher perspectives. And I think, Kim, when you were talking about it in a theoretical sense of how does it impact the electoral process, I picture it more. Imagine someone has gone to school, they've left home, gone to school, and now they're in this elite world, or they're a federal government manager, and everybody around them is sharing their perspective. And then they go back home and they meet their friends from high school. And their friends from high school are mocking members of Congress, are making fun of some of these things. I don't believe that these experts or elites would then say, oh, that's what most people think. They're probably thinking, what happened to my friends?
We're going to take one more break. When we get back, more with Scott Rasmussen.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel here with Scott Rasmussen. We're talking about this presidential election and the state of polling. I want to ask about this too, because you talked about the toxicity, and one result of that toxicity is that we've got a deeply polarized country, and we have had very close elections for a long time. I've seen you voice your concern about that sometimes, because you have pointed out that one of the merits of landslide elections, and we haven't seen any now since I was a kid, but one of the merits is that there was clarity in the outcome of the election. No one could dispute it. What do you envision happening this time? I'm assuming you're going to suggest that we are going to have another close election. And how concerned are you about disputes over its legitimacy?
Oh, I'm very concerned. I do think, unless something startling happens, it will be another close election. We know from our polling data that 60% of Democrats still believe Hillary Clinton was the legitimate winner in 2016. We know that 65% of Republicans still believe that Donald Trump was the legitimate winner in 2020. And so if this election is close, the only safe prediction is the losing team is going to feel that they were robbed, that the winner is not legitimate. This is a big concern. We've had 9 elections in a row where nobody has won more than 53% of the vote. 1984 was the last real landslide we had in America. And in that year, to the point you mentioned earlier, nobody said Walter Mondale could have won if he'd gone to Wyoming or Wisconsin or somewhere else, because he lost 49 states. That's an important part of the election process. It's not just picking the winner. It's adding legitimacy to the government itself. And you have that when you have a landslide. Landslides were very common up until 1972. And since then, the only real landslide we've had was 1984. We need that to purge the system. It's not going to happen this year.
Oh, well, that's demoralizing, but hey, let's look to 2028. Okay. Last question, just because I want to finish and give you a chance to talk about your industry, the polling industry, because I know you've thought long and hard about this, but this is your opportunity to give listeners your little advice about how to look at polls. You wrote a great essay back in 2020, and I'm going to read a line from it. You said, public pollsters act like a bartender who keeps pouring whiskey for a drunk customer and is then surprised when the customer wrecks his car on the way home. I think the point you were trying to make is polls are not a crystal ball, but as people are going through this presidential election, what would you advise them as they sit and look at polls? How should they use them as a tool?
Kim, I want to start with a story from 2018. I was polling Utah 4 for a local newspaper, and our last poll showed Burgess Owens winning by a point. And that was kind of a surprise. He'd been behind the whole campaign. Nobody really thought he was going to win. And Burgess was kind enough to win by a point to make my poll look good. And I could say, see, this poll was right on the money. But the reality is that poll had a 3.5 point margin of error. We had done a couple of alternative turnout scenarios, which showed Burgess winning by a little more or losing. All that a 1-point lead in that poll told you was there was a very close election to be decided by turnout. I would advise people to, number one, look at the averages, not individual polls. Number two, to apply a little bit of humility to your interpretation. You know, in 2016, in Michigan and Pennsylvania, polling averages showed the race to be in the margin of error very close. The last poll in each of those states showed Donald Trump ahead, but nobody could really believe it because they just couldn't envision. So look at the polls, take a look at the averages, especially the ones you don't like. And then rather than saying a 1-point lead means this race is over, say, ooh, this is a little scary close. And I know that's not satisfying. They want people to predict, just like you want a weatherman to predict what's going to happen tomorrow at 11 o'clock. That's not what polls are for.
Good advice. Never trust the weather and always be careful with the polls. So thank you, Scott Rasmussen, for speaking with me this week. Thank you to our listeners. We will be back next week with an edition of All Things with Kim Strassel from the Chicago Democratic National Convention. You can write to us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. And if you like the show, please hit that subscribe button.